The first thing John Merritt ever did for Gromma Stormbound was pull an iron bear trap off her ankle in the middle of a rainstorm, and she repaid him 3 days later with a freshly skinned rabbit hung on his porch post, and he lost that tally the very same afternoon by pretending he had never seen it. It was the autumn of his 3rd year on the Keld Frontier, the stretch of wild, half-tamed land that ran between the great pine forests of the north and the river settlements of the south, where men carved homesteads from the earth with their own bleeding hands, and where the world felt as though it had not yet decided what it wanted to become. John had claimed 40 acres on a slope above Gromma Creek, built his cabin from the timber he felled himself, laid stone for a hearth broad enough to warm a whole family he did not yet have, and settled into the kind of solitary life that a man earns when he has lost enough in the civilized world to stop wanting any part of it. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled when it was wet and eyes the color of creek water in November. He was not a man who sought much company. He was a man who kept his promises, fixed things that were broken, and left other people's business alone. The trap had been set by Aldrich Fenn, a trapper who worked the ridge above John's property, and who had a reputation for setting iron jaw traps beyond the boundary of what the frontier settlement laws permitted. John had found the trap 2 years prior and argued with Fenn about it, and the argument had gone nowhere because Fenn was the kind of man who smiled while he disagreed with you and kept doing exactly what he had been doing. John had stopped arguing and started making mental notes about where the traps tended to appear. He was checking his fence line in a steady autumn rain when he heard the sound. It was not a cry of pain, exactly. It was something controlled, something that had decided not to be a cry of pain, and was holding that decision with great effort. He followed the sound through the wet brush to a hollow between 2 fallen oaks, and he found her there. Gromma Stormbound was sitting with her back against one of the fallen oaks, her leg extended, the iron jaws of the trap closed around her ankle above her boot. She was an orc woman, full-blooded, with the broad, strong frame of her kind, and the greenish-brown complexion that deepened to dark olive at her cheeks and temples. She had a face that was arresting rather than delicate, with strong cheekbones and a jaw that carried authority, and small tusks that curved up from her lower lip with a natural elegance that John had always thought was a remarkable feature, though he had never said so to any orc he had met. Her hair was dark and thick, and braided close to her head in a pattern he did not recognize. She was wearing a long frontier coat of oiled leather over a heavy linen shirt and trousers tucked into boots that the trap had half destroyed. She looked at him when he came through the brush, and her expression did not change into fear or relief. It became something cautious and measuring, the look of a creature deciding very quickly whether this new element in her situation was a threat to be managed. He held up both hands to show them empty and stopped at a respectful distance. "That is a Fenn trap," he said. "He sets them wrong and the release is stiff. I am going to need both hands and I will need to touch your leg. Do you want me to talk you through what I am doing before I do it?" She looked at him for a long moment. The rain came down steadily around them. "Yes," she said. Her voice was low and clear with the slight resonance that orc voices often carried. "Talk me through it." He did. He explained each step before he did it. He crouched slowly, explained where he was going to put his hands, explained that the spring mechanism was on the left jaw and required his thumb braced against a specific point. He worked slowly and deliberately, and he could see the tendons in her forearms as she gripped the oak bark and held herself still. The trap released. She did not make a sound when it came off, though the skin beneath was abraded and already purpling. He pulled the trap aside and set it face down in the mud. "Can you put weight on it?" he asked. "I will know in a moment," she said, and pressed her palms to the ground and began to rise, and he did not rush to help her because she had not asked him to. She stood and put her weight on the ankle and her jaw tightened. "It is not broken," she said. "It looks like it will be badly swollen by morning," he said. "My cabin is a 1/4 mile down this slope. I have arnica salve and clean cloth for binding." She looked at him again with that measuring look. He understood what she was measuring. He was a human man on a frontier settlement, which meant she had roughly equal odds of finding him to be the kind of man who helped and the kind of man who did not. "I am John Merritt," he said. "I work this land. The trap is not mine, and I have told Fenn a dozen times to move it. You are welcome to walk with me or not." She considered the ankle, considered the rain, considered him. "Gromma Stormbound," she said. "I will walk with you." She limped, and she did it with a dignity that did not invite comment, so he matched her pace without comment, and they walked through the rain to his cabin on the slope above the creek. The interior of the cabin was one large room with a sleeping loft above, a broad stone hearth along the south wall, a heavy table he had built from split oak, 2 chairs, a workbench along the east wall hung with tools, and shelves of preserved goods in clay jars. He had a lantern going on the table, and the fire was banked low. It was the home of a careful, solitary man who took no particular pleasure in decoration, but cared deeply about function. He pulled the second chair close to the fire, gestured to it, and went to the shelf where he kept his medical supplies. She sat and unlaced what remained of her boot with methodical calm, and he brought the arnica salve and clean linen strips and set them on the table beside her. He did not kneel to apply them. He set the things down and stepped back. "You are capable of applying it yourself," he said. "I will make tea." Something in her face shifted. It was very subtle, a slight softening around the eyes, a small thing, but he caught it. "Thank you," she said. He made tea from dried yarrow and dried pine needle, frontier medicine that tasted of cold forests and worked reasonably well. He set a cup beside her and sat in his own chair and did not watch her work on the ankle. He looked at the fire. After a while she set the linen and salve aside and picked up the cup of tea, and they sat in silence for several minutes with the rain loud on the roof. "You are not from the settlement," he said eventually. It was not a question with accusation in it. He said it the way someone says it when they are simply noting a fact. "No," she said. "I am Stormbound clan from the ridge camps. I hunt this territory and trade pelts at Gromma in season." "The settlement folk at Gromma, do they give you trouble?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "Sometimes." "I know the factor there," he said. "Harden Clee, he is fair." "He is fair," she agreed. "The men at the tannery are not always fair." "I know who you mean," he said. He thought of the Brant brothers who worked the tannery and who were the kind of men who made frontier life worse for everyone who was not exactly like them. He did not say anything further about them. There was no use in it tonight. She stayed until the rain slowed. He gave her a length of clean linen to reinforce the binding on her ankle for the walk, and an old but serviceable leather boot from a box in the loft that was close enough in size to replace her damaged one. And when she tried to return them, he said he had no use for a single boot and would only lose it eventually, which was not entirely true, but was not entirely false either. She left when the rain gentled into mist. She stopped at the door and turned. "I owe you a debt," she said, and her tone made it clear this was not a social nicety. It was a statement of fact from a woman whose people treated debts as real and binding things. "You do not," he said. "I only did what anyone ought to have done." She looked at him with an expression that suggested she did not entirely agree with his assessment of what anyone ought to do, but she did not argue. She turned and walked into the mist, and John stood in his doorway and watched her go, and then went back inside and did not think about her any more than he could help, which was not very little. 3 days later he found the rabbit on his porch post. It was cleaned and hung with obvious skill, the pelt folded beside it as a separate gift. There was no note, but there did not need to be. He recognized the offering for what it was. He took the rabbit inside and cooked it in a stew and thought about what she had said about owing him a debt, and he thought about the careful precision of the offering, and he resolved very firmly to not make an issue of it next time he saw her, because doing so felt like it would insult something in her that deserved respect. He lost the tally by pretending it had never happened. He saw her again 6 weeks later at the Gromma market, which was held on the first day of every month at the wide flat ground beside the factor's storehouse. She was at a table near the edge of the market grounds, away from the denser press of the stalls, with a display of pelts and smoked meat arranged in front of her. She was dressed in the same oiled leather coat, with a vest of dark fur beneath it and her hair braided with small carved bone beads that he had not noticed in the rain. She was striking in a way that the word striking barely covered. He noticed several of the settlement men looking at her, and he noticed the nature of those looks, which varied from open hostility to something uglier that wore the mask of appreciation. She noticed, too, she had the practiced stillness of someone who had learned to reduce themselves into a smaller target. He stopped at her table. He bought a pound of smoked venison at a fair price and did not haggle, which was not the custom of the market but which seemed right. While she was wrapping it, she looked up at him and her eyes showed that she recognized him. "Your ankle healed well?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "completely." "Good," he said. "The rabbit," she said, looking at him carefully. "Did you receive it?" "I received a rabbit from somewhere," he said, "but I cannot be certain from where, and I have already eaten it, so the tally on that is entirely unclear." She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he could not quite name. It was not confusion. She understood him perfectly. It was something between amusement and something more careful, something that was deciding whether to believe he meant well. "The tally is not unclear to me," she said. "Well," he said pleasantly, taking his wrapped venison, "that is the difficulty with tallies. They require both parties to agree on the count." She watched him walk away, and he did not look back, but he was smiling as he moved through the market crowd. He bought a length of good canvas at the cloth merchant's stall and copper nails at the ironmonger's, and as he was loading his cart for the ride home, he heard raised voices near the edge of the market and turned to look. Two of the Brandt brothers, Josel and Clem, were at Gromma's table. Josel had picked up one of her pelts without asking and was making some comment to his brother about the quality of it, his voice carrying the specific sneer of a man who wants to be heard. Several other market-goers had turned to watch. Gromma was very still, the way she had been still in the rain with the trap on her ankle, managing the situation with rigid self-control. John set down his canvas roll and walked over. "Morning, Josel," he said, stepping up beside the table. "You are going to want to put that pelt down respectfully because you have not paid for it, and because it is fine work and you are handling it badly." Josel turned. He was a big man, a head taller than John, with the look of someone who spent a great deal of time deciding whether any given moment was an opportunity for violence. He looked at John and he looked at the pelt and he seemed to calculate. "Just looking," he said. "Looking is free," John said. "Looking costs nothing. Picking up a woman's merchandise without permission is something different." Josel looked at Gromma and then back at John with an expression that asked several unpleasant questions at once. He put the pelt down, not carefully but at least down, and he and Clem moved away through the market. John watched them go and then turned back to the table. Gromma was watching him. Her expression was the same careful, measuring look she had given him in the rain, except now there was something else behind it. "You did not need to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "It will make them hostile to you." "They are hostile to everyone," he said. "I have always found that indiscriminate hostility is somewhat less of a problem than the targeted kind." The corner of her mouth moved. It was the smallest possible version of a smile. "You have a curious way of thinking about things, John Merritt," she said. "I have been told," he said, and went back to his cart and drove home through the afternoon light feeling significantly better about the world than he had felt that morning. The winter came on hard and early that year, the way it sometimes did on the Keld Frontier, with a snowfall in early November that buried the fence posts to their crossbars and locked the creek in a skin of gray ice. John had prepared well. He had a full woodpile, a cellar stocked with root vegetables and preserved goods, a water barrel kept close to the fire, and a temperament suited to long solitary stretches of cold. He read by firelight in the evenings, mended tools and harnessed leather during the short gray days, and kept the cabin in the kind of order that suggested a man who was at peace with his own company, even if he was not entirely sure that peace was the right word. He found her at the edge of his property on a morning in late November, nearly 2 months after the market. She was checking a snare line she had apparently been running through the east edge of his timber, which was within her hunting territory as far as the frontier conventions understood such things, and she was doing it in a snowstorm that had come on suddenly from the north. The snow was heavy and wet, and coming sideways in visibility was the length of 3 men laid end to end. She had 3 rabbits at her belt, and a look on her face of someone who has been caught by weather, and is deciding how to deal with it. He appeared out of the white and she stopped walking. "How far is your camp?" he asked. 3 hours in clear weather, she said. He looked at the snow. They both looked at the snow. "Come inside," he said. She looked at him. "John Merritt." "Gromma Stormbound," he said in the same tone. "The storm will run itself out by morning. You can be on your way then. My cabin is warm and there is food." "I have food," she said, holding up the rabbits. "Then you can cook them in a proper pot on a proper fire," he said, "and eat at a table and sleep somewhere dry and not freeze to death in the snow. This seems reasonable to me." She looked at the snowstorm. She looked at him. She appeared to be conducting an internal negotiation. "All right," she said. He had a narrow rope bed in the sleeping loft and a wider pallet he could pull out near the fire. He gave her the loft because it was warmer, and when she tried to argue this, he told her the pallet was actually more comfortable for his back, which was a lie that both of them were aware was a lie. She cooked the rabbits with onions from his cellar and dried herbs from her pack, and the result was considerably better than anything he had made himself in weeks. They ate at the oak table with the fire going strong and the snow howling at the shutters. He learned things about her that evening. Not quickly or intrusively, but in the way that people who are comfortable with silence let information settle naturally into the spaces between long, quiet stretches. She was 26 years old, the second daughter of Stormbound clan's head hunter. Her mother had died of a fever when Gromma was 14, and her father had continued to lead the hunt until 2 winters ago when a fall from a ridge had broken his hip and left him with a limp that kept him close to camp. She had taken over his ranging territory and his trade routes as a matter of natural succession. She had 3 brothers, all older, all still at the ridge camp. She spoke both common and the Stormbound tongue, and had learned the measurements and mathematics of frontier trade from a traveling factor who had spent a season at the ridge camp when she was 16. She was precise, capable, deeply self-sufficient, and possessed of a dry humor that appeared infrequently but was, when it appeared, genuinely funny. He told her that he had come from Keswick province in the south, where he had been a carpenter's apprentice, and then a carpenter's journeyman, and that he had left when the town he had been building for 5 years had burned in a fire that was not his fault, but that had ruined him along with everyone else who had invested in it, and that he had come north to the frontier, because starting over on unfamiliar ground had seemed preferable to starting over on ground full of familiar failure. He had been here 3 years. He had rebuilt his hands from carpentry hands to frontier hands, which was a different kind of work but used some of the same instincts. He had thought occasionally about going back south and had discovered, as time went on, that he thought about it less. She listened to all of this with her chin resting on one hand and her eyes on him, and she had the quality of someone who listens completely, without planning their next words while you are still talking. He found this striking. He found most people plan their next words quite loudly on their faces. "You built this cabin yourself," she said when he finished. "Most of it," he said. "A neighbor helped me raise the ridge beam." "I cannot do that alone." "It is a well-built cabin," she said. She looked at the joints of the walls and the ceiling, the way the timber fit. "The joinery is good." "It is the only thing I do that I am genuinely proud of," he said. "You are also good at losing tallies," she said very evenly. He laughed. It was an honest laugh, not a polished one, and it surprised him somewhat. He had not laughed like that in a while. "I am exceptional at losing tallies," he said. She smiled. A real one this time, not the small corner movement but a full smile, which changed her face entirely and made his chest do something that he chose, for now, to file under the category of gratitude for pleasant company after too many months alone. She slept in the loft and he slept on the pallet by the fire, and in the morning the storm had cleared and left the world looking scrubbed and white and enormous under a pale blue sky. She came down from the loft dressed and braided and carrying her pack, and the 3 rabbit pelts rolled and tied. She made tea while he built the fire up, and they had tea and hard bread with salt butter, and neither of them spoke very much because neither of them needed to. She left when the light was good enough to travel. At the door she turned. "I owe you a debt," she said. "The rabbit stew was payment enough," he said. "I made that stew from my own rabbits," she said. "You made it in my pot," he said, "which I was getting very little use from. And you seasoned it with your own herbs, which improves the value of the pot considerably. I came out ahead." She looked at him for a long moment with something in her eyes that was no longer entirely measuring. There was warmth in it, careful and contained, but unmistakably warm. "You are a very strange man," she said. "Likely," he said. She walked out into the white morning, and he watched her go until she disappeared into the timber, and then he stood in his doorway for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, looking at nothing in particular. The winter passed. They did not see each other again until the spring market in March. But when they did see each other, it was immediately easy in the way that things are easy between people who have already skipped past several layers of social ceremony and arrived at something more direct. She had 2 beautiful wolf pelts and a quantity of dried elk meat and a carved bone knife handle of remarkable quality. He had honey and apple preserves from his root cellar and a length of hand-cut oak planking he had milled on the cold days of winter, bound for the settlement carpenter. He came to her table first, before he set up his own. He helped her arrange the pelts because the table was narrow and 3 was a crowd for it, and she let him help without ceremony. They traded compliments about each other's winter goods with the straightforward appreciation of people who both understand quality and do not bother with flattery. The Brant brothers were at the market again, and gave John a long hard look from across the grounds, but did not come near her table, which he considered a satisfactory outcome. Hardin Clee, the settlement factor, was a stocky, gray-bearded man of 50 who had been on the frontier since before it was called the Keld Frontier, and who had managed the Gromma trading post through 2 bad winters and a trade dispute that had nearly split the settlement along clan and human lines. He came by Gromma's table and examined the wolf pelts with a professional eye and named a fair price, and she named a slightly better price, and they settled on one in between with the businesslike ease of 2 people who had done this before and respected each other's competence. Clee nodded to John. "Merritt," he said, "you know this woman." "I do," John said. "She brings the best pelts on this frontier," Clee said to John, as if Gromma were not standing directly in front of him, and then caught himself and looked at Gromma. "Which you know," he added. "I do know," she said with a perfect neutrality. John had supper at the settlement in that evening, a low-ceilinged building called the Grey Post, where the factor and the regular settlers and the occasional passing trader ate together and argued about weather and land claims and the price of iron. Gromma was not at the inn. Orc people did not typically eat at the Grey Post, not because there was a rule against it, but because the accumulated weight of small hostilities made it not worth the effort. John thought about this while he ate his supper of roast pork and barley bread, and he found it sitting badly with him. He stepped outside after supper into the cold March night and found her at the edge of the inn yard, where the horses were hitched, eating dried elk from her pack and looking at the stars with the composure of someone who has long ago made peace with not being inside. "Come in and eat a proper meal," he said. She looked at him. "I have food," she said. "You have the same dried elk you have been eating all day," he said. "They have pork and hot bread and a tolerable cider. Come in." "John," she said, and in her voice was the clear understanding of what would happen if she walked into the Grey Post. "I will be there," he said. You will sit at my table and eat your supper, and if anyone has something to say about it, they will say it to me." She looked at him for a long moment. The stars were very bright above Graymere. The night was cold and still. "Why do you do this?" she asked. And it was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. She actually wanted to know. He thought about it honestly. "Because it is right," he said. "Because you have as much right to a hot meal at a public inn as anyone on this frontier. Because you have never been anything but decent to me, and you deserve decent treatment in return. And because I would like the company," he added, which was the most honest thing he had said. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she put her dried elk back in her pack and walked past him toward the gray post door, and he walked beside her. It was not without incident. There was a silence when they walked in, the kind of silence that rolls through a room like a wave. There were 3 or 4 men who looked long and unpleasantly. There was a murmured comment from the back corner that John did not quite hear and chose to respond to by looking steadily in that direction, until the source of the comment looked away. Hardin Clee, who was still at the bar with his evening ale, looked at the two of them, at the room, and then at the barkeeper, and said 2 of the pork and 2 ciders, which settled the matter by the authority of the man who most of the settlement depended on for their trading business. They ate supper at John's corner table, and the room gradually went back to its ordinary noise level. She ate with the focused appreciation of someone having a better meal than expected. The pork was good. The bread was hot. The cider was indeed tolerable. "Well," she said, when they had been eating long enough for the room to have largely forgotten them, "this is not the worst thing that has happened to me." "High praise," he said. "For this establishment fairly high," she said. He smiled. She smiled. They ate supper in a public room like 2 people who belonged there, which they did. After that they found a rhythm. The monthly market became a point of regular contact. He learned when she would be coming through on her hunting routes, and sometimes found his fence line checked or small useful things left near his woodpile. A coil of good snare wire, a bundle of dried herbs, once a beautifully cured piece of elk leather that was exactly the right size and thickness for replacing the seat of his worn-out work saddle. Every time he found one of these, he worked very hard at losing the tally. He had a fireplace brick she had helped him reseat the previous autumn when she had stopped by to trade a piece of information about a wolf pack that was running his fence line, and he mentioned the brick as payment for the snare wire, which made her eyes narrow with suspicion. He had 3 hours of her labor-splitting fence posts one afternoon in April when she had stopped at his property, and he had been in the middle of a task too large for one person, and he offered the use of his grinding stone for her knife blades as payment for the leather, and she pointed out that the grinding stone was free to use regardless, and that this did not constitute a legitimate tally entry, which made him laugh. She kept a very careful account. He kept losing it. The spring became summer. The summer was long and gold and green on the Keld Frontier, with thunderstorms rolling through the pine forests every few days, and the creek running high and cold, and the wild meadows going chest-high with grass and summer wildflowers. John planted a kitchen garden below the cabin and expanded his fence line to the south, and spent the long days building a proper smokehouse from fieldstone that he had been intending to build since his first year. He worked hard and steadily, and found himself thinking about her at odd moments throughout the day, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that was simply present, like background weather. She came by in July to tell him that the wolf pack had moved off his fence line and had settled in the high timber to the east, and she stayed the afternoon and helped him point the smokehouse mortar, and they talked for hours in the easy way that had become their custom, about her clan and his farm, and the politics of the settlement, and the quality of that summer's rainfall, and a dozen other things. She sat on the low wall of the smokehouse with her legs dangling and the afternoon sun on her face and the bone beads in her braids catching the light, and he sat on an overturned barrel across from her and thought that she was the most beautiful person he had encountered in his life, and that this thought had been sneaking up on him for a long time and had now arrived fully and was not planning to leave. He did not say this. He was not yet sure it was wise to say it. She was a stormbound orc, and he was a human frontier farmer, and the world they lived in was not particularly kind about such things, and he cared enough about her not to place her in the way of more difficulty than she already navigated every day. So he stayed where he was and thought what he thought and kept pointing the mortar. But he also noticed, in the weeks that followed, that she was spending more time at his property than strictly necessary for trading or information purposes. She came by on a Tuesday simply because she was passing. She came by the following week with a jar of good rendered bear fat for his smokehouse and stayed for supper. She came one evening at the end of July with a cut on her forearm from a branch that had snapped back on her in dense timber, not serious but long, and sat at his table while he cleaned and bound it and made no comment about his hands on her arm except that they were steady, which was said in a tone that contained more than the words themselves. He wanted to keep all of these tallies very badly. He could not afford to, because if he kept them he would have to acknowledge what they were, which was gifts, which was something beyond debt repayment, and he was not sure she was ready for him to acknowledge that. So he lost each one. He found reasons, explanations, offsetting values. He was extraordinarily creative about it. She noticed. Of course she noticed. She was precise and mathematical and deeply observant, and she had been watching him lose her tallies with increasing purpose for nearly a year now. She noticed, and she did not address it directly, but in her eyes when she looked at him there was something accumulating, something quiet and careful and very warm, and he noticed that too. In August, he rode to Gromma to report Aldrich Fenn's traps to the Settlement Council, which he had been building a case for over 2 years, by keeping careful notes of trap locations and dates. He brought his notes to the council meeting, which was held in the back room of Hardin Clee's trading post, and he presented them clearly and without excessive emotion. Fenn was there, and argued and turned red in the face and made it personal, but John had the notes and the settlement law on his side, and the council gave Fenn a formal warning and required him to remove all traps set outside his licensed territory within 10 days. He told Gromma about this when she came by the following week. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. "You did that because of what happened last autumn," she said. "I did it because the traps are illegal and dangerous," he said. "You did it because of what happened last autumn," she said again with certainty. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "among other reasons." She was sitting at his oak table with her hands flat on the wood. She looked at her hands and then at him. "John," she said. "Gromma," he said. "You are making it very difficult to keep an accurate tally," she said. "I know," he said. "This is deliberate," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long, long moment. Outside the cabin the August evening was making its slow golden business of settling toward night. The creek ran faintly below. A night bird started its evening song somewhere in the pines. "Why?" she asked. And again it was the genuine question, the real one. He thought about saying something clever. He thought about deflecting into another comfortable joke about lost tallies and unclear accounting. He looked at her, at the careful strength in her face and the warmth behind her eyes and the bone beads in her braids, and he decided that he had been deflecting for close to a year now and that it was beginning to feel dishonest. "Because I do not want to be repaid," he said. "Because everything I have done has been something I wanted to do. Because I would rather you stop keeping a tally and simply let me be glad that you are in my life, for whatever reason you care to be here." The silence that followed this was the kind that has weight. She held his gaze and did not look away, and he did not look away either. "I have never met a man like you," she said. "I have never met anyone like you," he said, and meant it without qualification. She was still for another long moment, and then she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her hand was larger than his and warm and calloused from years of honest work, and he turned his hand over and held hers and did not let go. "I do not know what this is," she said quietly, "between us, My people and your people do not usually, she stopped. I know, he said. I know that. And I do not know what anyone else will make of it, and I find that I do not care very much. I care what you make of it. I care what you want. She looked at their joined hands on the table. Something in her face was working through something, some old calculation, some long-held restraint. I want, she said slowly, to stop keeping a tally. I want to stop thinking of every good thing between us as a debt to be balanced. She looked up at him. I do not know how to do that. I have always kept tallies. My people keep tallies. It is how we know we are not beholden, how we stay free. You would never be beholden to me, he said. What is between us is not a debt. It is just, he searched for the right word. It is just that I want to be near you as often as you will permit, and I want you to be near me because you want to be, not because you owe me anything. She was quiet. Then she said very quietly, I already want to be near you. I have for a long time. He said nothing because nothing was needed. He held her hand in the August evening while the night birds sang, and the creek ran, and the golden light faded slowly from the windows, and they stayed there at that table together and did not move for a very long time. What followed was the kind of slow becoming that does not happen in a moment. They did not declare themselves in any grand way. There was no speech, no ceremony, no announcement. There was instead a gradual shift in how she arrived at his property, less like a visitor and more like someone returning. There was a gradual shift in how long she stayed. There were suppers that became long evenings and long evenings that became conversations that went deep into the night beside the fire. There were mornings when she was still there, when the light came through the east window, and the world was fresh and cold, and neither of them felt the need to explain why she had not walked back to her camp in the dark. Her family knew before John had any idea how they had found out. He learned this in September when she arrived at his cabin accompanied by her eldest brother, Gromma Stormbound, who was 34 years old and as large as a small mountain, and who looked at John with the expression of a man conducting a structural assessment. Gromma spoke mostly in the Stormbound tongue to Gromma, who translated with a composure that suggested she had anticipated this visit. The assessment was fairly direct. Who was this human? What did he want? What did he have? And what was his intention? John answered all 4 questions as honestly as he was able, including the 4th, which he answered by saying that his intention was to be worthy of her regard and to make her life better by being in it if that was what she wanted, and that he was aware the arrangement was unusual, and that he did not intend for it to be a source of difficulty for her family or her clan. Duras listened to the translation of all this with the expression of a man hearing something he did not expect. Then he looked at John directly and said something in common that was the first thing he had said in common. She kept coming back, he said, on her own. That tells me something. It tells me the same thing, John said. Duras looked at him for a long moment with the assessment ongoing. Then he nodded once with the weight of a man who has made a decision he intends to stand behind. You will come to the ridge camp before the first snow, Duras said. Meet the family properly. Yes, John said. I would like that. Duras left. Gromma stood in the cabin with her arms folded and an expression that mixed exasperation and relief in roughly equal measure. My brother approved of you, she said. I noticed, John said. Should I be worried that he is the easiest one? She made a sound that was almost a laugh. My father will be more particular, she said. Your father raised you, he said. He should be particular. She looked at him and the exasperation faded and the relief remained and something else came in behind it, something warm and open and new. Come here, she said, and he crossed the room and she put her hands on his face and kissed him for the first time, which was nothing like anything he had imagined and exactly like everything he had hoped, warm and certain and very direct, because she was always direct. He rode to the Stormbound Ridge camp in October, 3 weeks before the first snow came. It was a substantial camp, 24 structures in a clearing on the south-facing ridge, built from timber and hide and stone in the distinctive Stormbound style that he did not know well, but recognized immediately as the work of people who had been building in that country for many generations. There were children running between the structures and women working at outdoor fires and men moving between the camp and the timber, with the purposeful efficiency of people who knew exactly what needed doing before the cold arrived. Gromma's father, Stormbound, was a tall orc man of 55 with a gray-streaked braid, and the limp Gromma had mentioned, and the eyes of a man who had spent decades reading weather and terrain, and people with equal facility. He sat across a fire from John for most of an afternoon, and asked him questions in perfectly clear common, with the careful patience of a man who had all the time in the world, and intended to use it. He asked about John's land and its condition. He asked about the cabin and when it had been built and how. He asked about the settlement at Gromma and John's relationship with Clee and with the council. He asked about John's family in the South and why he had left and what he had left behind. John answered all of this as completely and honestly as he could, and Stormbound listened to all of it and fed sticks to the fire at intervals with a slow, methodical precision. At the end of the afternoon, as the light was going amber and long across the ridge, Brack looked at his daughter, who was sitting to one side of the fire with her youngest brother's 2-year-old child on her knee, and then he looked at John. "She is the best of us," he said simply. "Whatever she decides for good reasons. I trust her reasons." "So do I," John said. "Good," said Stormbound, and that was the end of the assessment. John stayed 2 days at the camp. He learned things during those 2 days that he had not known about her, and that filled in the picture of who she was in ways that made him love her more completely. He saw her with her father, who treated her with the quiet, deep respect of a man who had watched his daughter become exceptional and was not remotely surprised by it. He saw her with Duras and the other brothers, who teased her with the specific cruelty that brothers reserve for the sister they admire most. He saw her with the children of the camp, who treated her as an authority figure of the highest order, and also hid behind her when they were in trouble, which she handled with infinite patience. He helped with camp work during those 2 days and was not particularly good at it and said so, which seemed to earn him some credit. He was good at mending things, which was a universally valued skill, and he spent an afternoon fixing 2 broken hide scrapers and a cracked water barrel with the tools in his pack. And by the end of it, several people in the camp were looking at him with the look of people who have revised their preliminary assessment. He rode home on the 3rd morning with a full heart and a very clear sense of what he wanted his life to be, which he had not had clearly in a long time. The first snow came in mid-October that year, earlier than expected, a real snow and not just a dusting, 6 inches that fell overnight and left the frontier looking like a different world. By the 1st of November, it was clear that they were in for the kind of winter that the old settlers spoke about with respect. Cold came down from the north in sustained fronts, the creek froze solid by the end of November, and the pine forests turned into dark and silent columns above a white and motionless ground. Gromma moved into the cabin in November. This was not a single decision, but a sequence of smaller decisions that accumulated into an obvious conclusion. She had been spending increasing amounts of time there. Her hunting territory included his land and the land above it. The ridge camp was 3 hours away in good weather and considerably more in bad weather. The cabin was warm and large enough for 2 people, and increasingly full of evidence of 2 people. Her coat on the peg beside his, her braiding tools on the shelf beside his shaving things, her hunting bow and quiver hung by the door next to his rifle. One evening in early November she arrived in the middle of a hard sleet storm with her full pack and a bundle of her winter furs, and looked at him with a directness that left no room for ambiguity. "I am staying for the winter," she said. "Yes," he said, and took the bundle of furs and found a place for them on the loft shelf without any further discussion. They lived together in that cabin through the long Keld winter with the easiness of people who have compatible rhythms. She was an early riser, and he was somewhat less so, and she used his slightly later waking to make tea and check the weather before he was fully present in the world, which she seemed to find useful. He cooked better than she did with preserved and stored goods, a legacy of his carpenter's apprenticeship in a city where market food was available year-round, and a man learned to cook decently or ate badly. She was a significantly better craftsperson with leather and sinew and bone, and she worked at a corner of the workbench through the winter mornings on a series of small projects that produced things of genuine beauty and utility. He built a small, upright shelf beside her corner to hold her tools, and she looked at this shelf when she found it, and then looked at him with an expression of such plainly visible warmth that he had to look away. The tally problem persisted in a new form. She had largely stopped keeping a formal account of debts, which was the victory he had been working toward for a year, but she had replaced it with a deep attentiveness to reciprocity that was woven into everything she did. If he cooked supper, she found a way to provide something for it, fresh-caught fish from the ice holes she cut in the creek, or stored dried berry that she made into a sauce. If he mended something of hers, she used the time to mend something of his. He pointed this out one evening beside the fire, and she considered it seriously rather than defensively. "Is it so wrong?" she asked. "It is not wrong at all," he said. "I only wanted to make sure you knew that you do not have to, that what you give me by being here is already worth everything." She looked at him across the fire with the look that had been evolving since August, that had started as measured warmth and grown into something much larger and less guarded. "You are impossible to be in debt to," she said. "I prefer to think of it as being in abundance," he said. "When there is enough of everything, debt is the wrong measure." She was quiet for a moment, thinking about this. "That is a very foreign way of thinking," she said. "Foreign to me. My people think in terms of what is owed, what is given, what is balanced." "And your people's way is not wrong," he said. "It has kept your clan strong and fair for generations. I only mean that between you and me, I would rather think of it differently, as what we build together, which is not owed, it just is." She was quiet for a long while. The fire settled. Outside the snow was thick and still, and the night was absolute in the way that deep winter nights on the frontier were absolute. "I love you," she said. She said it with the directness she brought to everything, no preamble, no softening, just the fact of it placed carefully in the air between them. He felt the words land in him with a weight that was entirely good. "I love you," he said. "I have for a long time, since somewhere around the August smokehouse, if I am being accurate." "The smokehouse," she said. "I thought so." "You thought so," he said. "You looked at me with very particular attention when you thought I was not watching," she said, "during the mortar work." "I was admiring the quality of your stonework technique," he said. "You were not," she said. "No," he said. "I was not." She crossed the room to him and sat beside him on his wide chair as though she had done it 1,000 times, and put her head against his shoulder, and his arm went around her, and they sat that way for the rest of the evening, talking sometimes and silent sometimes, with the fire burning and the world frozen and perfect outside. The winter deepened, and then slowly it began to ease, which it did every year by a logic that felt like a promise kept. The days grew longer. The light came earlier. The creek ice grew gray and porous at the edges, and then began to run in channels through its center, and then one morning in March was gone completely, and Graymere Creek ran quick and clear and cold through the thawed earth, and the world smelled of mud and pine, and the specific green smell of things beginning. They had spoken through the winter about what came next. These were not alarming conversations, but practical and honest ones, conducted in the way that they handled most things, with directness and care. There were real questions. How would her clan receive a permanent arrangement? How would the Graymere settlement receive it? Where would they live? What did they each need? These questions had complicated answers, but they worked through each one without avoiding the difficult parts. Gromma Stormbound received the news in April when they rode to the ridge camp together and told him. He listened, sitting by his fire with his bad leg stretched out, and he looked at his daughter and then at John with the measuring look that appeared to be a family trait. "You are certain," he said to Gromma. "I am certain," she said. He nodded. He looked at John. "You understand what you are asking her to carry," he said. "Not an accusation, a serious question." "I understand some of it," John said honestly. "I understand that the settlement will not receive this without difficulty from some quarters. I understand that there will be people who treat her worse because of her association with me. I understand that I cannot fully understand what it has been like to be her in this world, and that I should be honest about that." He paused. "I also understand that I intend to spend the rest of my life making it worth it, and that I will not stop working toward a situation in which she faces less difficulty, not more." Brack looked at him for a very long moment. "Stormbound people partner for life," he said. "We do not take these things lightly." "Neither do I," John said. Another long moment. The spring wind moved through the ridge pines. "Then you have my blessing," said Brack Stormbound, and reached across and placed his large hand briefly on John's shoulder, which John understood was not a small gesture. Duras, for his part, clapped John on the back with enough force to stagger him, and called him something in the Stormbound tongue that Gromma translated, later, as something approximately meaning obstinate and well-meaning idiot, which she explained was a significant compliment coming from Duras. The Graymere settlement was a more complicated matter. Hardin Clee received the news with the equanimity of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by the frontier. He said he had seen stranger arrangements work out well and stranger ones work out badly, and that the determining factor was invariably the character of the people involved, and that as far as character went he had observed both John Merritt and Gromma Stormbound over several years, and had no complaints about either. He offered a handshake to John and a respectful nod to Gromma, and went back to his ledgers. The Brant brothers were another matter, as expected. Josel Brant made his feelings known at the spring market with a volume intended to reach the whole grounds, and John walked over and had a very quiet conversation with him, in which he outlined very clearly the specific consequences that would follow if Josel made Gromma's presence at the Graymere market into a continued source of difficulty. And he said all of this in a tone of complete calm that was apparently more unsettling than anger would have been, because Josel went quiet and did not cause trouble at the market for the rest of that season. There were others in the settlement who were less hostile but no less uncomfortable. There were people who avoided them, people who watched from across the market grounds with uncertain expressions, people who had known John as a quiet and reliable neighbor and were now visibly recalculating him. Some of them came around. Some of them did not. John had long ago made peace with not being universally liked. Gromma had never expected to be. They moved through the settlement together with the combined steadiness of two people who had decided what they were and did not require anyone else's confirmation. The wedding, such as it was, happened in June on the slope above Graymere Creek, in the meadow that had gone chest-high with summer grass. It was a blended ceremony because they had decided together that it should be, half in common and half in the Stormbound tongue. Brack conducted the Stormbound portion from his seat because his hip would not allow him to stand for long, and he did it with a gravity and a precision that made it feel like the old words had been waiting their whole existence for this particular use. Hardin Clee stood as witness for the common law portion, as he was the settlement's appointed authority on such matters, and signed the document in his careful factor's hand without a moment's hesitation. Duras and the two younger brothers were there, and half a dozen members of the Stormbound clan who had ridden down from the ridge. A handful of settlement folk came, fewer than John had hoped, but more than either of them had fully expected. The innkeeper from the Grey Post, a wide woman named Merritt Halst, came and brought bread and a crock of her good ale and stood in the meadow grass with her arms folded and an expression of profound approval. Old Aldrich Fenn, who had apparently been informed of the event and whose traps had been permanently relocated 2 years past, came and stood at the edge of the gathering and did not cause trouble, which was the best John had ever expected of him. They stood in the summer meadow above the creek they both knew, and they made their promises to each other in two languages. And the storm-bound words that Gromma spoke were old words, old as the ridge camp and older, words that bound with the weight of generations. And John's words were simpler and newer, and perhaps less weighted with ceremony, but entirely true, every one. She wore a coat of fine dressed leather over a linen shirt, deep green like the summer pine, and the bone beads in her braids were augmented with small carved wood pieces that her youngest nephew had made for the occasion. He wore his best linen shirt and his good dark wool vest and felt that he was somewhat outclassed in the matter of presentation, but that this was appropriate. When the ceremony was complete and Brack had spoken the closing words in Stormbound and Clee had folded the document into his inner pocket, Gromma looked at John and he looked at her and she said something quietly, only for him. "There is no tally for this," she said. "No," he said. "There is not." "I do not know what to do with that," she said, and she was half laughing, her eyes bright. And he put his hands on her face and kissed her in the summer meadow in front of everyone, which produced an approving noise from Merritt Halst and a series of extremely loud comments from Duras and his brothers that required no translation. The years that followed were not without hardship, because no years on the Keld Frontier were, but they were good years in the way that good years are not simply the absence of bad things, but the presence of something real and solid to stand on. The cabin grew. John added a second room the first autumn of their marriage, a proper bedroom separated from the main room by a log partition, and the following spring he added a porch along the south wall where they sat in the evenings when the weather allowed. Gromma's hunting territory shifted gradually to center more on his land and the land around it, which was productive territory, and which she knew as well as anyone. And she continued to trade at Gromma every month, and her standing at the market increased steadily, as the quality of her goods was impossible to argue with, and as time wore down the novelty of her situation, and replaced it with simple familiarity. Their son was born in the second autumn of their marriage in October, when the maples along the creek had turned the color of old copper, and the mornings were cold, and the afternoons warm with the last of the autumn gold. He was a strong, loud, remarkable child, greenish-tinted at the cheeks and ears and forehead in the way of orc blood, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's lighter hair, and he arrived into the world with an opinion about things, and has apparently not stopped having one since. Gromma named him Brackmere after her father, with John's agreement, and Brack Stormbound rode down from the ridge camp when he heard the news with his bad hip and his gray-streaked braid, and sat by the fire in John's cabin holding his grandson with an expression of such complete and unguarded joy that John had to make himself look away because the moment felt private. Brack Stormbound died the following spring, quietly in his sleep, in the ridge camp he had spent his life building. Gromma went to the camp for the mourning period and John went with her, and they stayed 7 days, and John did what he could, which was not enough because nothing is ever enough in grief, but which was something. He sat with Duras and the brothers through the long morning nights, and he helped with the necessary work of the camp, and he did not leave her side unless she needed to be with her people alone, and she always knew when she needed that, and he always read it correctly, which was the way they had come to work. She grieved with the full force of who she was, which was considerable. She was not a woman who made grief small. She also came out the other side of it with the clarity that real grief sometimes gives, the knowing of what matters and what does not. She came home to the cabin and to Brackmere, who was by then walking and getting into everything, and she stood in the doorway of the cabin looking at it, at the new room and the porch and the kitchen garden and the smokehouse and the fence line stretching away to the south, and John watched her look at all of it. "He would have liked what you have built," she said. "We built it," he said. She turned and looked at him with all of it in her face, the grief and the love and the forward-looking thing that was stronger than both. "Yes," she said, "we did." Their daughter arrived 3 years after Brackmere in the spring, which seemed appropriate. She was different from her brother in almost every way, quieter and more watchful, darker in complexion than Brackmere. With her mother's broad frame even in infancy, and her father's tendency to look at things carefully before deciding what to do with them. Gromma named her Myra, which was common rather than stormbound, and the evening after the naming she explained to John that she had chosen a common name deliberately, that Brackmere carried the stormbound heritage in his name, and Myra would carry the human frontier heritage in hers, and that she wanted both of her children to be able to walk in both worlds with their names preceding them as a kind of introduction. John sat with this for a moment, and then said that this was one of the most thoughtful things he had ever heard, which made her look at him with the expression that she still sometimes wore, the one that was trying to decide whether he was real. Brackmere, at 3 years old, was uncertain about his sister for approximately 2 weeks, and then became fiercely protective of her in the way of older siblings everywhere, which required constant monitoring, because his idea of protection and the world's idea of acceptable behavior were not always in agreement. Duras came to the cabin the summer after Myra was born, officially ostensibly to see the new child, but actually to spend a week helping John rebuild the woodshed, which had been leaning alarmingly since the previous winter's heavy snow. He was a remarkably skilled builder when applied to a problem, and they worked well together once they established a shared technical language, which took most of the first morning and resulted in a compromise system that was better than either of their initial approaches. In the evenings, Duras sat with Gromma by the fire and spoke in the stormbound tongue, and she laughed more in those evenings than John had heard her laugh in months, which he thought was exactly what was needed. Before Duras left, John found him at the woodshed in the early morning, running his hand along the new wall joinery with the critical eye of a man checking his own work. "It is good wood," Duras said. "Good seasoning," John said. "2 years in the stack." Duras nodded. He looked at the cabin, at the kitchen garden, at the porch where Gromma was sitting with Myra in the early morning light, nursing her, with Brackmere running in circles in the yard. "She is happy," Duras said. "Not a question. I try every day to make sure of it," John said. "She was not always," Duras said. "Before this, after our mother died, she carried things, heavy things." He was quiet for a moment. "She still carries them, but differently now." "Yes," John said. "I was wrong about humans," Duras said. He said this with the deliberate precision of a man making a significant admission. "Not all of them, you specifically. I was not certain I could be wrong about this, and then I was." "I appreciate that," John said. "Do not tell her I said it," Duras said. "She will never let me forget that I had to learn it." "Agreed," John said, and they went back to checking the woodshed wall and said nothing further about it. The years accumulated the way good years do, each one different from the last but all of a piece, part of the same ongoing construction. John expanded the farm. He cleared another 10 acres to the south and planted a modest orchard of apple and pear trees that would not produce seriously for several years, but that he planted with the long view of a man who expects to be around to see them bear. He repaired and expanded the fence line and added a second animal pen. He was a capable and increasingly respected member of the Gromma community, in the way that people who do reliable work and keep their word tend eventually to be respected regardless of other complications. Gromma's reputation at the market continued to grow. In the 5th year of their marriage, Hardenclee offered her a position as a trading assessor, someone who evaluated the quality of incoming pelts and game goods and set fair prices before trade was completed, a position that required exactly the combination of precision and knowledge that she had. She accepted and performed it with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, and within 2 seasons the Gromma market had a reputation for reliable fair pricing that drew traders from 30 miles in every direction, which was good for everyone. The Brant brothers eventually left the settlement. Josel got into a serious dispute over a land boundary with another settler that went to the council and was resolved against him, and the two of them moved their operation north to another settlement where their reputation had not preceded them. John did not mourn this. Gromma did not mourn it. The market ground felt lighter without them. There were still difficult days. There were still people who looked at their family with something unwelcoming in their eyes. There were still moments when Gromma came home from the market with a particular quietness that meant something had been said, and John learned to read this quietness, and to respond to it in the way she needed, which was not always with words and not always with silence, but sometimes with one and sometimes with the other, and he had become reasonably good at knowing which. And there were moments when the weight of being the ones who had crossed a line that their world had not expected to be crossed felt heavier than usual, and they sat with that weight together as they sat with everything together, which made it lighter. Brackmere grew into a child who was entirely himself, neither wholly human in his ways nor wholly orc, but something that partook of both and was not confused about it. He was a physically capable child, strong beyond his years in the way of orc blood, but also patient and curious and a remarkably good listener, which came from somewhere else. He spent summers at the Ridge Camp with Duras and the Stormbound clan, learning to hunt and to read weather and to speak the Stormbound tongue with proper fluency. He spent winters at the cabin, learning to read from the books John had sent from Keswick and to do figures and to work wood, which he turned out to have a genuine gift for. Myra was different, as she had always been. She was quieter and more inward, a girl who observed everything and spoke carefully and precisely when she spoke, and who had, by the age of 6, established a set of opinions about the world that she maintained with considerable firmness. She was deeply attached to Gromma in a way that was specifically physical, always near her, always touching her arm or her braid, always turning to check that she was present. Gromma received this attachment with complete naturalness, as though it were simply the right order of things, and John watched the two of them together and thought that there was nothing in the world that looked quite like a mother and daughter who were also, at some fundamental level, built of the same material. In the 7th year of their marriage, there was a hard summer, a drought that turned the frontier brown and cracked the creek down to a trickle and destroyed the kitchen garden and threatened the orchard. It was the kind of summer that broke some homesteads on the frontier, when people discovered that what they had built was not yet solid enough to withstand the bad years. John worked harder than he had worked in years, hauling water from the creek's remaining pools, rigging shade cloth over the youngest orchard trees, making difficult decisions about what could be saved and what could not. Gromma rerouted her hunting routes to territory that was less affected and brought back what game she could, and preserved everything with relentless efficiency. They ate simply through that summer and did not complain about it. In the evenings they sat on the porch and looked at the dry brown hills and talked about next year and the year after that, because the horizon was always where they looked. They lost 2 of the orchard trees. The rest survived. The kitchen garden was replanted in the fall from saved seed. The creek recovered with the autumn rains and ran clear and cold again by October. They had come through it, and they had come through it together, and John thought, sitting on the porch in the October evening with Gromma beside him and the children asleep inside and the creek audible below in the darkness, that this was what it meant to build a life. Not that nothing broke, but that you rebuilt. Not that the weather was always kind, but that you learned the weather and worked with it. Not that the world accepted you, but that you made your own acceptance in the way you lived. Are you happy? He asked her. He asked it the way he had learned to ask things, simply and directly without performance. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the dark hills. I am deeply happy, she said. There are still things I carry, the loss of my father, the days when the settlement reminds me of what I am to some people. The knowing that Brackmere and Myra will also carry things because they are what they are in this world. She paused. But the happiness is larger than all of it. That is what I did not expect, that it would be so much larger. He took her hand, her large, warm, capable hand. I did not expect this life, he said, any of it. I expected 40 acres and a cabin and a quiet old age. I got considerably more than that. You got an orc woman who made your accounting very difficult, she said. he laughed. He laughed fully and genuinely as he had always laughed with her. "I got the best possible version of all of it," he said. She leaned against him and they sat in the October dark and listened to the creek and to the wind in the pines and to the small sounds of their children sleeping inside the cabin they had built. 10 years after the morning John Merritt pulled a trap off Gromma Stormbound's ankle in a rainstorm, the cabin on the slope above Gromma Creek had become a place that people knew. Not in a famous way, but in the way that good and reliable things become known in a community, by their consistency and their quality and the absence of any hidden strangeness in them. People came to John for woodwork and for advice about building, because he was genuinely skilled and because he was honest about what he did not know. People came to Gromma at the market for her assessment work and for her goods and increasingly for her judgment about other goods, because she had a reputation for accuracy that was by now completely beyond dispute. Their children moved through both worlds with the particular confidence of children who know exactly what they are. Brackmere, at 10, was already a better hunter than most of the adult men at the Gromma settlement, and was beginning to show real talent with a woodworking plane that made John's heart full in a way he struggled to describe. Myra, at 7, was reading at a level that astonished the settlement's occasional schoolmaster, and had opinions about everything that she expressed with a precision that made visiting adults blink. In the 11th year, something happened that John had not anticipated but perhaps should have. The Gromma settlement had grown, as frontier settlements do when they survive long enough, and a new council had been formed to handle the increased complexity, and Hardin Clee, who was now past 60 and thinking about retirement, came to John with a proposal. The council wanted a frontier liaison, someone who could maintain relations with the Orc clans in the region, because there were now 3 settlements within range of Stormbound and 2 other clan territories, and the interactions between them had become complicated enough that a dedicated point of contact was needed. Clee thought John and Gromma together were the obvious choice. He asked if they would consider it. They sat with this for several evenings, talking it through the way they talked through everything. "It would make us more visible," Gromma said, "more exposed." "Yes," John said. "There are people in the settlement who would not accept an Orc woman in any kind of official role." "Yes," he said again, "and there are clan members who would question whether I could be trusted if I was formally tied to the settlement." "All of that is true," he said. She was quiet for a moment. But we are already doing most of it informally," he said. "You have been bridging between the settlement and the Ridge camp for 11 years. I have been the human face on half a dozen disputes that needed one. We are already the liaison. They are just asking to make it official." "And official means protection," she said slowly. "Legal standing, a seat at the table where the decisions are made." "Yes," he said, "for us and for our children." She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire was going, and Brackmere and Myra were in the loft, the sounds of sleep coming down from above. "Then yes," she said, "we do it." They accepted the position jointly, which was itself unusual enough to cause comment, but which made practical sense to everyone who thought about it for more than 30 seconds, which was most of the people in the settlement who were not already committed to obstruction. There was a period of adjustment that was occasionally uncomfortable and sometimes worse than uncomfortable, and there were moments when John had to draw on reserves of patience that he had not been certain he possessed. But there were also moments of something better than he had hoped. There were moments when a clan elder came to a meeting that would previously have been all human and sat down at a table like someone who expected to be heard. There were moments when a settlement farmer spoke to an Orc trader with a directness and a respect that had not been present in the early years. There were moments when the distance closed by small fractions and the frontier felt less like a contested boundary and more like what it actually was, a shared place where multiple kinds of people were building lives from the same difficult earth. Not everything closed, not every wall came down, but enough did, enough to matter. Merritt Halst at the Greypost became, over the years, one of their staunchest allies in the settlement, a woman of enormous practical authority whose approval was worth more than any official endorsement. She had come to Brackmere's first birthday celebration with a cake she had made herself, and she had been present at Myra's naming, and she had once backed John up in a council meeting so forcefully and so intelligently that Josel Brandt had not recovered his argument. She was not a sentimental woman, but she was a fair one, and she had decided, apparently some years back, that John and Gromma were worth being fair about. "You two have done something rare," she said to John once, standing outside the Greypost on a spring evening. "I will not make more of it than it is, but it is rare." "She deserves all the credit," John said. "You both deserve it," Merritt said firmly. "Anyone who says different is not paying attention." In the 14th year of their marriage, Gromma Stormbound married a human woman from a northern settlement, which caused an even more considerable stir in both communities than John and Gromma's marriage had caused, partly because Gromma's was the size of a small mountain, and his wife was a small, fierce, red-haired woman named Cor, who appeared to have made her decision with the same complete certainty as Gromma's, and who was entirely unbothered by anyone's opinion of it. Gromma and John attended the ceremony at the Ridge Camp, and John spent most of it trying not to visibly cry, which he managed imperfectly. After the ceremony, standing at the edge of the camp with the evening coming in gold over the ridge, Gromma took his hand. "He followed us," she said. "He found his own way," John said. "But he watched us find ours first," she said. "Cor told me that. Duras told her that we were proof it was possible." John looked at the camp, at the people gathered, at the mixture of faces and sizes and the sound of two languages mixed in the evening air. "We are proof it is possible," he said. "That is not a small thing." "No," she said, leaning against him. "It is not a small thing at all." The children of that frontier grew up knowing the world differently than their parents had known it, which was the whole point. Brackmere, at 15, was tall and broad and green-tinted, and moved through the Graymere settlement and the Ridge Camp with equal ease and was respected in both, which was not ordinary and which he treated as ordinary, which was exactly right. Myra, at 12, had decided that she wanted to be a trader in the tradition of the frontier factors, a woman who moved between settlements and clans with goods and information, and kept the complex machinery of frontier commerce running, which ambition no one who knew her found remotely surprising. John Merritt was 42 years old on the morning. He stood on his porch above Graymere Creek with a cup of tea cooling in his hand, and looked at the 40 acres he had carved from the Keld Frontier 14 years before, which were now 60 acres, and included a kitchen garden that had survived a drought and an orchard that was beginning its proper bearing years, and a woodshed and a smokehouse, and a second animal pen, and a porch on the south wall where the evening light came in long and golden when the weather was right. He looked at it all and felt the particular satisfaction of work that has gone on long enough to see itself become permanent. Gromma came out of the cabin door behind him with her own tea and stood beside him and looked at what he was looking at. "The northeast apple tree is finally setting fruit properly," she said. "I know," he said. "It took its time." "Some things take their time," she said. "Worth the wait," he said. She leaned against him the way she had learned to lean in the early winter years, comfortably and without ceremony, her head against his shoulder. "I thought of something," she said. "Tell me." "The very first debt I tried to repay you, the rabbit on the porch post." "I remember it," he said. "You said you had already eaten it and the tally was unclear," she said. "That is correct," he said. "I have been thinking," she said very seriously, "that over 14 years of deliberate tally losing, the accumulated debt is quite significant." He looked at her. Her eyes were bright with the contained amusement that he loved most about her face. "Catastrophically significant," he said, matching her tone. "I may be quite irretrievably in debt." "Deeply in debt," she agreed, "to a level that simple accounting cannot resolve." "How do you propose to address it?" he asked. She looked up at him with the full weight of everything in her face, the love and the humor and the history, and the life they had made on this slope above a creek in the wild, half-tamed country of the Keld Frontier. "I already have," she said, "every day for 14 years. He kissed her there on the porch in the morning light, and the orchard grew below them, and the creek ran cold and clear through the land they had made their own, and somewhere in the loft their children were beginning to wake, and the Keld Frontier was a little more of what it had always been trying to become, a place where people could make a life worth living if they were stubborn enough and kind enough and patient enough to stay. They had been all three. They intended to remain so. The tally in the end was never settled. It simply dissolved into something that had no need of settlement, into the accumulated ordinary substance of a shared life, into the weight of two people's hands held together in an autumn meadow and a winter cabin and a summer drought, and every ordinary and extraordinary morning thereafter, into the names of two children who walked in two worlds and were diminished by neither, into the woodwork of a cabin built to last, into the boundary of a fence line that ran true, into the voice of a woman speaking old words in a new place and meaning every one. John Merritt never did find those tallies. He looked for them sometimes in the firelight in the evenings, and he always came back to the same conclusion, that they had never really existed. What had existed from the beginning, from the moment he had held up two empty hands in the rain and offered help without condition, was simply this: two people finding each other in the wide and difficult and beautiful country between everything they had been and everything they were going to be. He thought that was worth more than any tally ever kept. He thought it every morning when he woke, with the light coming through the east window and the sound of the creek below and the warmth beside him that was hers. He thought it and said nothing about it and kept it like all the best things, quietly and completely and for good.